Welcome to Story Chat Radio. We are book editors Carly Hayward and Jenny Chappell. Every month we watch a different movie with an eye for storytelling and novel writing.
We use our years of training and experience editing novels to break down each movie's storytelling elements to help you improve your novel in progress.
Warning, Jenny ruins everything.
Hey, you ruin things too.
So don't be surprised if there are spoilers. On this episode of the podcast, we are discussing the Halloween classic Hocus Pocus, and then we'll end with a critique of One Lucky Author's Query. Don't forget you can support the podcast on Patreon, where you can read the queries we critique, plus get lots of other bonus content, including monthly writing chats with us and the most adorable Story Chat Radio stickers. It's easy to find, just patreon.com/storychatradio. And now it's available on YouTube. The link is on our site and Linktree on social media. It's just at youtube.com storychatradio. Not the website, but... All right.
So here come the spoilers. The movie starts with a little prologue on October 31st, 1693 in Salem, Massachusetts. The Sanderson sisters, three witches named Winifred, Sarah, and Mary, kidnapped Emily Binks and drain her life force, then turn her brother Thackeray into an immortal black cat. The townsfolk sentence the sisters to be hanged for murder, but Winifred casts a curse that will resurrect them during a full moon on All Hallows Eve if a virgin lights the black flame candle in their cottage. 3 centuries later, Max Dennison, his younger sister Danny, and his crush Allison visit the former Sanderson cottage, which is now a museum, where Max inadvertently resurrects the witches. The Sanderson sisters promptly try to take Danny's soul, but the kids escape. The immortal cat Binks tells Max to take Winifred's spellbook and then takes the group to an old cemetery where they will be safe since it's hallowed ground. The witches eventually catch up to them there, and Winifred raises Billy Butcherson from the grave and sends him after the children. The witches pursue the children across town, and Winifred reveals to her sisters that the spell that brought them back only works on Halloween, and unless they can suck the life out of at least one child, they will turn to dust when the sun rises. After luring them back to or into the high school, where there's a musical number because you can't have the divine Miss M in a movie and not let her sing, the children trap the witches in a pottery kiln and burn them alive. Max and Allison open the spellbook, hoping to reverse the spell on Binks, and not realizing that the curse revived the witches, and the open spellbook acts like a beacon to Winifred. Back at the cemetery, Billy joins the fight against the witches as they attack from the air and snatch Danny. Winifred attempts to use the last vial of potion to suck the soul from Danny, but Binks knocks the potion out of her hand. Max promptly drinks it, forcing the witches to take him instead. But then the sun rises and turns all the witches to dust. Their deaths break Thackeray's curse, freeing his soul and reuniting him with Emily as they both head off into the afterlife, and Billy returns to his grave to sleep. As the movie closes, Winifred's spellbook opens its eye once more, which means the witches could possibly return again someday. Dun, dun, dun. Carly, what did you think about the movie?
I really enjoyed this movie. It was one of those that growing up, like, everybody loved it, and it was almost like too much of a cult favorite that I didn't really love it as much as a kid. But
you couldn't be that mainstream.
Yeah, maybe, or I don't know. I think I just got sick of it.
Yeah,
I liked it a lot more this time, actually.
Good.
I also think I didn't like that 90s boy teen cringe as a kid. I really couldn't handle it, and I didn't like Max at all, and I found him completely annoying, mostly as a kid, also now, but now I can forgive it a bit more. As a kid, I was like, ugh. But the rest of the movie is just so fun. I am sad that Danny doesn't get an immortal cat as a pet, though.
Oh my gosh, that's what I remember thinking as a kid.
I get that, like, Binks wouldn't enjoy that, and that's a terrible life for him.
Is it, though?
But it's the dream.
Like, is it?
Well, I mean, she's like, all of my ancestors will take care of you, so he's just watching them all die for the rest of his life. It does sound
That would
bad.
be sad. Yeah. Thanks for ruining my dream.
You're welcome. But I love Billy and his whole contribution. The Sanderson sisters are wonderful and campy and super extra.
Yeah.
They nail their parts in the best way. As usual, I'm very much choosing to ignore the 90s cringy stuff that normally you and I would probably tear apart.
Yes.
But because sometimes it's just good to enjoy a thing for what it is.
Yes.
So I liked it. What'd you think?
Yeah, this movie is 100% pure cheese in the best possible way. And if you're looking for something unexpected, this is not the movie for you.
No.
It's all tropes all the time, used exactly the way you think they're going to be. Yeah. So there's not a lot of surprises here. But yeah, the Sanderson sisters are so over the top and campy, and the whole thing really is just a lot of fun. And as an adult now, and having seen lots of other movies since then, the actor who plays Billy Butcherson has done so many amazing roles, including the unnamed fish character in The Shape of Water. He's just done
that's
him?
him?
That's him.
That.
Doug Jones. He's done all kinds of great stuff.
Oh.
And apparently I think he reprises the role in Hocus Pocus too, which we're not really talking about, but
I am excited for it though.
Yeah, same. So anyway, that scene in the high school where Winifred glamours all the adults in town is so perfect from a kid's perspective. Adults are so weird. Who knows why they do anything they do? And I do feel I have to mention that, I know we're not going to tear it apart, but I do feel the feminist side of me definitely struggles with any portrayal of witches like this.
Yeah.
And something about it being set in Salem makes it worse for me because I know about the actual historical witch trials and how sad that was in real life.
I know.
But in general, I feel that's something I have to take up with society and not so much this one particular movie. So setting that aside, what's something that this movie does well that authors can use in their writing?
Age category. You kind of actually even touched on it already.
Yeah.
So this movie is rated PG, which means it may not be appropriate for young children. Mm-hmm. The book age category equivalent would probably be lower middle grade.
Yeah.
And so we haven't really gotten into age category much on this, although we've mentioned it quite a few times.
Yeah.
It is one of those things that feels super obvious and easy to understand, but a lot more goes into it than you might initially think.
Yeah.
So if this movie would be the equivalent of a lower middle grade book, let's see how it kind of fits that. So, well, to start, it revolves around Halloween and trick-or-treating. Mm-hmm. It focuses on kids. It has a lot of silly young jokes. The movie focuses on what would kind of scare children and what they would relate to. So it's terrifying and also thrilling that all the adults would be away and hypnotized to basically ignore them and not listen to them. But also it feels really relatable because kids always feel like adults don't listen to them. That they're on their own and they have to figure it out themselves. It also gives us more conflict and freedom for the kids to run around and actually fix the problem themselves, which is just bonus. Even the inciting incident, daring each other to break into a place they're not supposed to be, and doing something really small, like just lighting a candle to get some light. Those are things that, kids would totally do, but also that feeling of the smallest act can lead to big consequences that you could not have predicted. I feel that's a very middle grade sensibility of not understanding consequences.
Yeah.
And the whole movie is about kids trying to get people to listen to them, feeling very left out or othered, and grappling with a lot of the unknown, which perfectly fits in the middle grade genre. I really could go on and on about what it is like to be 11, but I think we kind of all remember those feelings and all that uncertainty. Yeah. So a middle grade book will really focus on those issues, letting that reader feel seen and making it really relatable.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I was also thinking about how, so because this was made in the early 90s, I think the rating system has changed since then. Because I think in some ways, like some of the jokes and stuff, I think in this probably would be like PG-13 now, instead of like PG then. And I have watched some movies with my kids that were like from when I was a kid, and they were rated PG-13, and we watched them and they had like swearing or like other things you wouldn't see in a PG movie now.
Yeah. I did that with my brothers. I was like, yeah, we can watch Ace Ventura when they're really little.
Yes.
And then there's a huge sex scene, and I was like, I don't remember that when I was a kid.
Totally. And I think the first one we did like that was Spaceballs. And I was like, well, this is not exactly appropriate. I probably shouldn't have been watching this at the age I watched it at.
Yeah, you ignore it. Anyway.
Totally, yeah. But so it is really important to know and understand your intended age category and how that fits into the publishing industry as a whole, because this is really one of the most important factors in how you're going to sell your book. Like, you'll hear advice a lot to imagine where your book would sit on a shelf in the bookstore or a library. And that's totally applicable here. Like, generally, those divisions are made by age category first and then genre. So depending on the store or library, there may be separate sections for adults, teens, and then children. And then within children, that would be divided into like even further into like picture books, young reader books, and then books for older readers, like this middle grade category. And then, so for each of those age categories, there's a set of conventions, standards, expectations about what's appropriate and what's interesting to those readers. So like you were saying about how you pull your readers in and really let them feel like they're being seen. So yeah, it's important as a writer to know which of these areas your book fits into, because that's really like, it impacts which agents you're going to query if you're going the traditional route, and then which categories and places you'll market your book if you're self-publishing. So Hocus Pocus was marketed toward families, which means that it needs to be appropriate for all but the youngest children, and also have elements that will appeal to their parents. So like the relationships between the main characters and everything they go through, like you were saying, is familiar to children's experiences. And then also the tropes like the big brother thinking he's too cool for trick-or-treating and the little sister teasing him about his crush are like really common in media for kids. And then there are some elements that will go over younger kids' heads. So I'm thinking of like the tongue-in-cheek dirty jokes, like when Winifred says, we desire children, and the bus driver's like, it may take me a couple tries, but I don't think that'll be a problem. And so beyond that, we're always talking on the podcast about like reader expectations. So your readers will have an idea about these conventions and standards, even if it's not something they're consciously aware of. And you don't want to give them something that feels so far outside of that they're going to be disappointed. It would be kind of like biting into a chocolate chip cookie, only to find out that it's actually raisins and not chocolate chips. And it's not to say that people can't like both. But if you're expecting one and then you get the other, it's going to be an unpleasant surprise. So like chances are you're going to put that cookie down and then look for the one you wanted, and like maybe even give that cookie a bad review on Goodreads. So,
I always give cookies bad reviews on Goodreads. That's where I do all my cookie complaining.
Yeah, smart.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah, I think that's a really good analogy, though. The factor that most people kind of think of when it comes to age category is the age of your main character or your MC, which makes a lot of sense, but also it's not always 100% reliable. Age category is a lot more complex than that and relies on a lot more elements. So I'm going to do like a quick list of all of the elements, and then I'll break some of them down. So when you are considering what you need to do for specific age categories, it'll come down to voice, content, themes, references. There are things that they won't understand that will take them kind of out of the story. Tropes, the main character's ages, the POV, aka you don't want an adult POV and kidlit. The level of interiority, focus of that interiority, vocabulary, and word count. So to break some of these down further, voice. We talk about it a lot. It influences a lot of these elements on its own, and is probably one of the most important elements to get into with each category. How your characters sound, what they're interested in, who they are, what concerns them. All of these elements tie into voice and who the person is. And all of these elements tie into age and their level of maturity. A 12-year-old will sound completely different from a 16-year-old and a 30-year-old. This then kind of leads into content. So are you focusing on work, on school, on romance, on sex, on violence? Different content belongs to different age categories. Very, very obviously. We're not doing gang murders in middle grade. Hopefully. Then you get into kind of like themes and interiority, which we've already touched on a little bit. But what does a person that age care about and worry about? What types of problems do they encounter? How would they respond to those problems? Would they look for someone older to help them at first, or would they try to ignore the problem until they can't do that anymore? A younger kid is much more likely to worry about getting into trouble or disappointing their parents. Teens might be worried about messing up their future or not being taken seriously.
Right.
Then, and like on and on and on. Adults worry about adult things. We're adults.
Taxes.
Taxes.
According to my team, that's all adults think about is taxes.
Yeah, taxes. That's it. I'm pretty sure that's right. So
Totally accurate.
accurate. And then we get into things like references, vocabulary, and word count. These elements tend to have pretty clear delineations. The older the reader is, the longer the book can be. Obviously, outside of genre conventions, that's a whole other thing. The older the reader is, the more advanced the vocabulary can be, and the older the reader is, the older the references can be.
Right.
So don't write a book for middle grade kids that is 500 pages, uses words like hyperbole, and references the Manson cult.
Right.
That's just not fitting, and nor would I have read that as a kid.
Right.
It just won't connect. So anyway, these are a lot of the elements to consider, and you really want to take into consideration and make sure they align with your chosen age category.
Yeah, that's like, I feel like we could probably do a podcast episode about each one of those elements, because there is really a lot to learn there.
There's so much, and I couldn't get into all of it.
Totally.
Or it'd be an hour plus.
I think what's really important, and it's one of the reasons everybody's always saying, if you want to write, that you have to read, and you have to read your age category and genre that you want to write, so that you can pick all of these things up.
Yep.
So let's talk about adult fiction a little bit. So adult fiction is probably the least restrictive when it comes to market conventions. So like, to put this back in terms of movies for a minute, movies for adults can be R-rated, but they're also often only PG or PG-13. So, for example, Hidden Figures is rated PG-13, but it doesn't really mean that the movie is childish.
Right.
You can write an adult book with main characters who are kids or teens, or you can have multiple points of view with a mix of ages. The content can be anything from like cozy and lighthearted, like rom-coms and cozy mysteries, all the way through very dark, violent, and sexy, like a lot of thrillers or grimdark fantasy. I think what keeps a story really from feeling childish, even when the main characters are children, is the narrative voice, content, themes, references, tropes, and then that level of interiority and the focus of interiority. So, for example, the book Girl in Translation by Jean Kwok. The main character, Kimberly, is only 11 until about halfway through the book. And then even then, through the rest of it, it only goes through like her high school years. But the first person narrator is clearly adult Kimberly looking back at her experiences. And so she frames the story through her adult mind and gives like appropriate interiority and focus because of that. So like, in other words, the adult narrator shows things the child version of herself may not have. So these wouldn't be interesting or even fully understandable for a child reader. And there are also elements of the plot content that wouldn't be appropriate. So themes in adult fiction can really run the gamut, but the focus is more on like the human condition or a larger community and less on one individual.
Yeah, that's a great point. All right, so YA fiction. Let's get into young adult. It's honestly probably the most versatile age category, I would say, maybe. It's extremely popular among readers of all ages. I was going to say agents. No, ages. I certainly still read it. I mean, I have to and should because of my job, but also I would do it anyway.
Yeah,
and I feel
too.
like most adults will read YA. A great young adult book transcends a lot of age groups, mostly because adults still remember what it is to be that age. And some of the themes are still really fitting for adults. And honestly, YA pushes the envelope on like diversity and representation better than most genres do.
Yeah.
Most adult books do.
Right.
So anyway, you tend to know what you're getting with a young adult book. In general, you won't have extremely like kinky sex, although more and more sex has become acceptable in YA. You won't have the main character dealing with their marital problems, dealing with having kids, or having a ton of responsibility and complex work relationships.
Right.
YA focuses on coming of age, figuring out who you are, finding your voice, and finding your people. And even adults need to remember how to do this and struggle with this, so that's why it still connects. So what mostly defines YA to me is the coming of age theme. Whether it's a fantasy where they have to fight the darkness or a contemporary dealing with a mysterious new kid at school, the main character will come to know themselves better than they did in the beginning. They'll be more of their authentic selves. To me, that's really what defines the genre, though there's certainly a lot more elements that go into it, like worrying about school, people not taking you seriously or treating you like a kid, being annoyed with your parents, struggling to control your own life, and also extremely high emotions.
Yeah.
A crush is an epic love, and someone they don't like is an archenemy. YA books lean into those high emotions of being a teenager and feeling like everything is the biggest thing in the world. So YA very much relies on themes and interiority and voice to kind of set it apart from adult books, especially as YA gets into darker stories and content lately. So while the age of the main character is important, it's very important to make sure they sound like a teenager and that they deal with the themes and interiority that reflects how hard it is to be a teenager.
Yeah. You're also not going to have any point of view characters in a YA that are outside of the age category.
Yes, that too.
Yeah, so you can do that with adult, but you can't really do that with the younger age categories.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You don't want to be a teenager reading about
Like a 40-year-old adult.
Yeah.
No, or a
that's
little
not
kid.
fun.
That's even worse.
No, that's way worse. Ew.
Yeah, so Carly, you mentioned that Hocus Pocus would probably be middle grade. And I was reading about this movie in preparation for the podcast, as I do, because I got to research it.
You're so good at
like,
that.
Go down the rabbit hole. And apparently it was originally written with all the characters being 12, which I think is, that's perfect for middle grade and probably explains a lot of the middle grade feel. Middle grade is such a fun age category because it's like halfway between kids' books and teen books. And so it draws some on both of them. And because there's been a lot of growth here recently, some of the boundaries are getting pushed a little in terms of word count and a lot more diversity in terms of characters and topics. Although honestly, like this age category has always been pretty good at different kinds of representation, much more so than adult fiction has been. So what that translates to is that authors writing middle grade stories can play with some of the elements like romance, but they have to keep it within the realm of what's appropriate for their reader's age. And I think this is part of what makes middle grade really tricky. 12 is like the upper age limit for a middle grade character. And the readership is usually considered ages 8 to 12 because there's this general rule in kidlit, which Carly, that kids read up, meaning that kids really want to read about other kids who are a little bit older than they are. So like, when you're a kid, you always want to be older than you are. You're always looking for that next milestone.
A 12-year-old's not reading about an 8-year-old.
Right, exactly. So for example, if you have a romance and a middle grade story, it has to be appropriate for the average 8-year-old, which means keeping it limited to the level of like first crushes, a la Max and Allison, who are honestly a little too old to be middle grade protagonists. But number one, this isn't squarely the same as middle grade books because it's a movie. And number two, it was also made in the 90s and the rules about kidlit were different then.
Yeah.
So it's important to note that there's this smaller divide within middle grade. So, I said it's like 8 to 12. But then it's divided into like the 8 to 10 range, which is usually chapter books, which means lower word counts, and simpler stories, just less complex. And then the 11 to 12 range has higher word counts, deeper interiority. But even then, kids this age are not quite as reflective as teenagers.
Nope.
So you have to limit how much angst goes into the story. And then theme-wise, middle grade stories are usually more focused on friends, family, and local community than they are like the individual self.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like middle grade is on family, young adult is focused on self, and adult is focused on everybody else beyond self.
Yeah.
It's kind of, basically young adults are very self-centered. We all know this.
Yeah,
So,
it's part of their individuation process, psychologically speaking. So they have to be.
It's healthy.
It's important.
It's important. Anyway, so finally we're going to get into the young kids category, age category, aka like picture books and early readers. I'm going to start this section with a huge disclaimer. I do not edit for this age category, neither does Jenny. Therefore, this won't be as in-depth as the others, and, do your research into this a bit more, because this will be more of an overview. So, early reader books and picture books have a huge focus on vocabulary and word count. Obviously, the word count is very low here, as these young readers can't read very well, or the book is meant to be read to them out loud. And the vocabulary needs to be extremely simple and easy to understand for the age of the child. Another really interesting thing that young reader books get into a lot more than anything else is rhyme and meter. Usually picture books have a consistent meter to them to make reading it out loud easier, and it's easier for the kids to follow along. It makes it feel like a song, basically.
Right.
And it helps them to understand the content and learn to read better, because having those kind of consistent meters and rhymes means they can it's catchier and they can focus more on learning. Think of like Dr. Seuss books and how they rhyme and have that consistent meter or pattern to them. Obviously, the next thing would be imagery and how those pair with the words. But we're not going to get into that because we're definitely not experts on that. But basically, young reader books need to focus on simple stories and themes that aren't very complex. They are like single adventures that can be read in one sitting and have a flow to make them memorable. Okay, I'm going to stop there and we shall move on to our query.
All right.
This month, our query is a middle grade fantasy. Jenny, what are your thoughts on the query?
So overall, I think it's pretty strong.
Yeah.
I love the premise of the story. I especially love that it focuses on the relationships between sisters. Focus on family, like I said. And I love the comp titles. Percy Jackson is timely again because of the Disney Plus series coming up.
Can't wait.
And the Rick, I never know how to say his name.
Jordan?
Yeah. Present series is a great comp given the Jewish mythology in a modern day setting in this story. The only thing the author might want to consider here is that they're both related to that same author, even though he didn't write both of the stories. So maybe use a comp that isn't. So the first comp that comes to mind is The Serpent's Secret. It's a very similar kind of story, but it's not that Rick Riordan series. So what did you think, Carly?
I love this query. I think it's really good. I love the sound of the story too. Gets into Jewish mythology, which you said, which I personally really love, and is focused on a sister relationship.
Right.
My only other suggestion would be to focus a little bit more on why the sisters don't get along. Because the last line about the stakes claims that one sister needs to forgive the other. But what does she need to forgive her for? It seemed like they more had a problem of jealousy, not that anything actually happened, or if something did happen, it was the main character that did the bad thing. So I got a little confused there, but that's a very small note. Other than that, I loved it. I thought it was great. I don't have too many notes. I want to read it.
Same, yeah.
So yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah.
Any final notes? We good?
Yeah, no, I think we're good.
All right. So next month, we are watching the 1996 comedy, The Birdcage, and we will also have another query or blurb critique. If you want your query featured on the podcast, you can find the details about how to do that on our website or Twitter page.
You can find our podcast on our website, storychatradio.com, or you can follow us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or many other streaming services. While you're there, please leave us a rating. You can see this month's query in its entirety and support the show at patreon.com/storychatradio, and you can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at storychatradio.
Thanks for joining in our nonsense.